Okay, well, I think we will go ahead and get started for today. Oh, just a sec. We still have a couple of people coming in. I'm not great at multitasking. I'm trying to admit people from the waiting room and talk at the same time. Okay, so let's get started for today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are very, very pleased to be offering the next installment in our History Speak series for 2021, which was unfortunately canceled last year. But we're back today, and we are going to be joined by our guest speaker, Roger Nason, to hear his presentation called A Glimpse at the History of the Tripp Family Farm and the Beginnings of Tripp Settlement from 1784 to the 1940s. My name is Heather McDonald. I'm a member of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society. So our presentation today will be followed by a question period. So if you do have any questions during the presentation, you can feel free to go ahead and write those in the chat, and then we can address them at the end of the presentation. Just a little housekeeping in terms of Zoom etiquette. If you wouldn't mind, please keeping your microphones muted during the presentation. And if you do have a lot going on in your background and you feel like it's very distracting, if you wouldn't mind muting your video as well. And if you do have a question at the end, Evelyn Fiddler will be moderating the question period, and she will be unmuting you if you want to ask your question. So first, I want to thank the committee who helped bring this together, and that includes Russ Hunt. I'm glad to see him joining us today. Sheila Moore and Evelyn Fiddler, and Ann Hunt, our president, has helped us out a lot as well. So thank you so much. We're happy to be here today. So now I would just also like to point out that this talk is going to be recorded, so you will be able to see it again and share it with your friends who may have missed it. And we will be uploading that link to the recording on our website and Facebook page in a day or so. Remember, please, to like us on Facebook so you can hear about all of our upcoming events and projects. And we're always looking for new members. So Evelyn will talk about that at the end as well. Let's get right to our guest speaker for today, Roger Nason. We're so happy to have you here. Roger Nason is a graduate of St. Thomas University, yay! From the history department. He holds an MA in history from UNB for his study of St. Andrews from 1820 to 1983. He was a historical resources specialist with the Provincial Archives from 1972 to 76, a historical resources administrator for the museums branch from 1976 to 83, and a coordinator for bicentennial events for the city of Fredericton from 1983 to 85. He did tell me before he was sick of parades by this point. His career took him from Oromocto to Fort McMurray to Cuba, but since retirement, he finds himself exploring his home province. He hails from Grand Manan and started researching World War I veterans from the island and writing their biographies for the local paper. Since expanded that research to tracking the lives of Black World War I veterans in New Brunswick. He's published many articles on Black history in New Brunswick on the website activehistory.ca, which I encourage you to bookmark and explore. But today he's here to talk to us about the original Peleg Tripp property at 570 Tripp Settlement Road and its evolution through the generations, providing insight into the life and times of those early families and settlers to the area. So without further ado, I would like to ask Roger to unmute and turn on his video and take it away, Roger.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? It looks like it.
Yep, you're good to go.
I had my makeup artist in, so I hope that I don't look like death warmed over. But today we're going to explore the story about this farm. But first of all, I would like to begin by thanking my son, Peter, and his wife, Elaine, who own the farm, with the chance to sort of experiment on them in looking at the activities centered around the farm and then working it back through history to see what actually took place on that acreage and their neighbors and so on. But it turned into much more than I thought and a much bigger project. when I began, and I finally wrote it up at Christmas of this past year as part of it. There's still several chapters that I now know could be done because of other information that's been found. But for those who aren't familiar with New Brunswick, I'll start off by saying that I'd like to give a shout out to some relatives on the Irish side and also possibly from Norway who might be dialing in to listen to the talk. And my hope is that this will stimulate some questions and some feedback so that we can fill in some of the blanks and broaden the picture about the farm and Tripp settlement. First of all, I should say that during this COVID period, it's a bit of a challenge when you're trying to write anything of a historical note, because often there are many sources. You'd like to go to an institution like the Provincial Archives to be able to search them out, but that's very limited. Appointments and the limitations of just getting back and forth, also including keeping all the social distancing and the rest of it. So I've had a great advantage in that so many of the resources of the archives and newspapers and other things are digitally available. And so I've relied on basically 4 areas of resources, which include broad use of newspapers, because it turns out, as many of you probably know, the Irving newspapers put their back issues up going back to 1874 for many of the local papers in New Brunswick. And so, and their search engine, while it is not a great one, does provide some information on getting a lot of local details that I would never really be able to get at before. At the Provincial Archives, it provides a great resource too, because the vital statistics that Danny Johnson worked on that source the newspapers, they source papers that are not available in other repositories. And so that helped very, very much. But one of my biggest reliance in doing the research has been using the registry office for deeds and mortgages, for legal documents and other things that for York County go back to 1783. Now, most people don't know that those records up to the 1930s are digitally available through familysearch.org, which is an allied arm of ancestry.com. And of course, ancestry.com is certainly one of the big sources for census records and other materials to be able to connect all of these people. And there are people out there who have been researching families in the Tripp settlement area. Although I discovered right away, no one has ever done any kind of definitive work related to the Tripp family itself. So I actually had to build my genealogy as I went in order to understand who the players were. So with that in mind, I'd like to explain to those who aren't familiar with the geography that Tripp settlement is part of what is called Bright Parish in York County. Formerly, when it first started in 1783, was actually called part of Douglas Parish and then split off later. But I'm going to start and use a series of maps and photos that I hopefully will guide us along the way. So I'm going to try to share that now and not lose you. So here we go. Now, can everyone see the map?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Okay, this, what you see in front of you is a standard land grant map that's modernized for our purposes, but when the end of the American Revolution came, and 35,000 loyalist refugees, civilians, as well as disbanded soldiers of the British Army, were given lands in New Brunswick as a reward for their services and homes for the new refugees that fled the American colonies at that time. They were laid out in various formations up and down the St. John River and along the coastal areas. This area along the Keswick stream, which you see in front of you, I'll blow it up a little bit here. You can see the individual names. Each person that was eligible as a refugee was given basically 100 acres as an adult. And if you were married, it would add an extra 50 acres. And if you had children, another 50 acres per child. So that's why you see an uneven number of acres going up and down the river. So the acreages might be, in this case, here's one for 210, and it'll go 500 and 250 and so on, depending on the size of the family and what the original grantee was allowed. These names that are on here are the names of the original grantees that first received the allocation back in 1783-84. This particular group in Tripp settlement, and you'll see Tripp settlement here, and going, I guess I have to back it up just a hair so that we can see that. The Tripp settlement road comes up here, turns and heads towards Burt's Corner. And this area was all part of the Corps of Guides and Pioneers, which was a military regiment that was disbanded. And they received these lots on both sides of the stream, all the way up through what we know as Burt's Corner in Zealand and down to the mouth of the Keswick stream. And much like this, up and down the St. John River, the same happened, as it was for civilians as well. But the thing you discover right away as you study this period is that within the first 2 or 3 years of the arrival of these people, you can imagine none of this was accessible except by stream. And they would come to, the surveyor would initially come to the mouth of that stream, and he would start surveying out. And so lots stretched from a river bank back into the wilderness. And in this case, they really didn't have any idea what their back line was. They just knew approximations that if you were 200 acres, it went so many chains and feet into the woods. And often it was left up to you to try to define those lines and begin your settlement and try to build something. Often, if it turned out the land was swampy or unusable, in the first 2 or 3 years of that settlement period, people began to move very much up and down the system. They began to buy land from others who had more suitable land. Sometimes people who desired to live more in the town than out in the countryside would swap land. They would buy land from one another. And so when I was doing my study of St. Andrews, I found there was a high level of mobility, even more than you suspect, in which people went up and bought up the lots of the original grantees so that they could get more arable land on which to live and raise their families. This is no different with the Tripp family, because they did not originate from this area. They originally were below Fredericton, in the area near Gagetown and Hampstead, which was part of Washtenaw Lake. And so their first grants for their families was actually in that area. And it took another nearly 15 years before they made their presence known in Tripp settlement. And the first of those was the senior member of the family, whose name was, and you can pronounce it various ways. Tripp is with 2 P's, of course, and that makes a challenge when you're searching documents. But also, his first name was either Peleg, as some pronounce it, or Peleg, as you hear it in some areas, or just different emphasis on the syllables in the way that it's pronounced. But for our purposes, I like to call him Peleg. I think that's more the local pronouncement going back through the years from what I'm told. So Peleg Tripp Sr. and his family, who originated from Rhode Island, had come up to settle and receive land down in that, towards that Gagetown area. It was very unsatisfactory, and immediately they began to look for other land. Of course, these people knew each other, and they knew relatives or other people in the disbanded regiments or communities who came from the same area they did. And so communication was not as limited as one would think. They would keep in touch. And in short order, the Tripp family heard that there was better opportunity up at the mouth of Keswick than there was down in their area below Fredericton. And that's by 1790, many of the families began to make movements, sell their property in that area and move up to this area. So when we pick up our friend, Peleg, at that time, he has heard from one of the original grantees who didn't take up his land. And this is the gentleman here you see, whose name is Andrew Husband. And he was allocated originally 500 acres. He never actually settled on the land. He sold it before he ever saw it. And so that was passed on to another family named Good. And in turn, this is when Peleg and his family heard that this lot was available, and they made arrangements to buy it from Mr. Good. His name was Abraham Good. So lot number 5 of 500 acres ended up coming to Peleg and his family to start trying to do some settlement. So if you can imagine back in that era, they would have landed by stream at the mouth down here, which we call along the Sisson Settlement Road, and have to make their way up into the higher ground in order to find what land was arable, what was available, was there any timber, could they make a living on the land? And it was then that they had made their way up into the higher levels and into that area that was lot number 5. By the way, lot number 5, for those who are familiar with the families in the area, actually came down through to the Inch family and became Harry Gilby's property. And so our friend, Mr. Tripp, in the beginning, was looking about, and he immediately cast his eye next door on what was called the Sisson lot. James Sisson only had 215 acres, but he decided to sell out to Peleg and his family as well. So in short order, by 1809, Peleg had bought both lot number 5 and lot number 6. And lot number 6 is the lot in question, which now has fallen to my son and daughter-in-law, or at least a portion of it. So this is actually the beginnings of what we have come to know as Tripp settlement. They were the first to arrive in that area. Now, I'll go to the next map. I hope these are showing up correctly.
Yes, they're great, Roger.
Okay. Just blow this up a little bit. Now, as you can see, here we are, James Sisson Jr. and Andrew Husband. So lot number 5, lot number 6. You can see all these other various names, and I have actually searched these in order to find out what happened to some of the original grantees. And believe it or not, probably out of 10 or 12 of these lots, none of the original grantees took up their lot that they were granted by government. They all sold out and moved on. Some of them never even showed up. And sometimes when that happened, the colonial government would find out from local landowners who were in the area that nothing had been improved on those lots, and therefore they would actually be empowered to reissue them, and they could sell them by auction, or they could simply have someone come forward who felt that they were entitled to a lot and had not received it as a refugee, and they would be given the lot. And of course, the understanding was that within a 1 to 3 year period, they would make a certain amount of improvements in terms of clearing the timber, building initially probably a log cabin, getting some arable land, maybe a cow, and some some other farm animals that they might have to get by with. And with those kinds of improvements, they would be firmed up in a proper title to the land. So it would fall into their family. And this was sort of the pattern that went on. It varies considerably across the colony, but that's the general way it happened. Now, now we're going to jump to this atlas. This is an atlas in 1878. And as you can see, we're coming from the mouth of the Keswick Stream, and the road for the Tripp Settlement Road generally follows the way it always has, coming up through and then following along. And you can see the names of the farm owners along the way. And there's Jones and Morris and W. Inch, and then S. Tripp. Now, this is actually lot number 6, the one in question that we're going to be looking at. And you can see it comes up and turns and goes over to Burt's Corner. And also you can see where it turns off to what we call the Sisson Settlement Road, and that it went down towards a stream where those lots came up from the river. Now, across the way, the big area there was owned by, and it's incorrectly spelled here, but that land eventually came down to Daniel McGrand, McGrand. And Daniel was a good Irishman who came over with part of his family and ended up raising 6 daughters. Most of that land today is part of the lot that we know as belonging to Glen Pye. As we come up here, you can see that this would be the Key Road going up to the Ridge Road, and this would be the Holyoke Road going up to the Ridge Road. So this is 1878, and by this time the farms were pretty well established, and many of these, some of these families had intermarried with some of the Tripps along the way, but this is marked S. Tripp because that stands for Stephen Tripp. And the reason they're on this atlas is that it was a peculiar practice that when these companies made atlases of counties in the 19th century, particularly in the 1870s and 80s, they would go along and actually, like door-to-door salesmen, would get subscribers, and you would pay $2 or $5, and your name would appear in it, and so you would actually get a copy of the atlas when it was done, because this was for all of York County, but they would put your location in the atlas wherever it would appear. And they were remarkably accurate in their locations. So this one is in pretty good shape. Now, to connect Peleg and Stephen, we have to come down to Peleg Jr. Uh, Peleg Sr. married a lady named Jane Ogden, and the Ogdens also came up to that Gagetown area, and they all came out of Rhode Island at that time. Peleg Sr. And his wife were getting on in years when they first arrived. So many of their children had moved out of their household back in Rhode Island. And when they came up, they went their separate ways. But 3 or 4 of the sons in that family stayed with Peleg, including Peleg Jr., but also a son, William, and a son, Stephen. And there was also a son, Asa. During the period in the 1820s to the 1840s, it was a very turbulent period commercially. Unfortunately, following a robust economic rise after the War of 1812, when war had brought on a lot of trade and other activity in the colony, they went into a bit of an economic depression in the 20s and the early 30s. And the country out around many of the urban communities like Fredericton suffered for that. They couldn't sell their produce at the price that they normally could get. And so many of them fell on hard times. Well, Peleg Jr., who took over the farm from his father and was looking after his father and mother, he was one of those victims. And during that period in the 20s and 30s, searching the registry office records, it turns out there was a real mystery connected with the handling of their property and lands. And going back and forth in the 1820s and 30s, the land was between lot number 5, the Gilby property, and lot number 6, was passed back and forth 5 or 6 times. Come to find out, poor Peleg Jr. had gotten himself in a bit of a stickler. He had apparently taken out a mortgage with a merchant in Fredericton before there were any sort of system of banks. And so the richer merchants often would lend money. And in order to survive, he had taken out a mortgage on his property. He was not able to repay it. But in the ensuing dispute over it, he slandered the merchant, according to the courts, and he was fined 215 pounds, which was a considerable amount of money at the time. I don't know whether that included what he owed the merchant or not, but he was about to lose the property to a sheriff's sale. This, although uncommon, it did happen frequently during this economic recession, where people just couldn't hold on to their property. And so Peleg was very smooth about it. He went to see his brother-in-law, who was a member of the Smith family down in Gagetown, and Asa Smith took over his property and bought it at the sale for a very knockdown price. He held on to it for 2 years and then sold it back to his brother-in-law. So it was back into the Tripp family. So it was a little sleight of hand, but we think of those as modern day kind of events that take place. But those lessons started very, very early. In one instance, he passed the land from himself to his wife. She held title to the land until things simmered down, and then they put it back in both their names. So you have that happening as well. So there was a very turbulent time in those 20s and 30s, and they came close to losing both properties, which was nearly 700 acres. But Peleg was able to hang on to it, and he actually made an agreement with his son Stephen that he should take over. And several members of the family got involved in the process. And but Stephen was the one that actually leased it, and he started farming the land as a single man, as long as he would look after his father and mother. And so there was a long, detailed agreement in the 1840s where he would look after them for the rest of their days. And he would be the one who would come by the farm at the end of that period. Peleg Jr. had died in the late 20s, and or yes, if I got that correctly. And his mother did live on there, and she lived right up into the 1850s. So in the census records, we see Stephen with the family and looking after his mother at that time. And he also had two sisters there at the other time. Gradually, members of the family married off. There was a Matilda and a Rhoda, and they ended up marrying next door neighbors, someone in the Jones family, as well as somebody connected with the Inches, and those families, and the Yerkses. So you get them intermingling. As they say in most of early history in New Brunswick, there weren't many candidates in the neighborhood for marriage material. So you didn't wander very far to find a mate. And so if you're doing genealogy, you sometimes just looking down the road, you may find a connection to a family. And that seems to happen quite frequently. Now, by the time the 1850s and 60s had hit, there was a major movement of migration out of New Brunswick. The railroads had come along, travel was better. This road that we now view as the Tripp Settlement Road, by the 1830s, it had turned from being a bridle path and simply a trail into a wagon path. And by the 1830s, the colonial government has seen fit to build it up so that it was at least half a chain wide, which is 33 feet. And today's roads are more like a chain wide, 66 feet. But by that time, instead of having to access property from the Sisson Road, which was a much more usable road at that time, by this period, these roads were well developed, and all of these were fronting on the road as we see them now. In the earlier period, they were at the back and the top of the lots as we see them. So I'm watching my time because Heather didn't say how long I had, and she said I might have to stop at 6 o'clock. So just kidding. But as it is, as happened in the 1850s and 60s, there were a great number of people from Burt's Corner and the Ridge area who actually got the urge to move west. Many of them went to Ontario. Others could easily make the trip through New England and out to the western states. Some went as far as California. But Stephen Tripp joined a brother, William, who had actually made his way up to Ontario in the 1840s. And he had settled in the corridor area now, as we call it, between Hamilton and London at Ingersoll, Ontario, and in a small community there, just south of Ingersoll. And they got well established by the 1860s. And Stephen and his sister actually went up that way and saw them, but they kept going. And Stephen joined another brother whose name was Sanford in Minnesota. Minnesota and Wisconsin in the 1850s and 60s was a real drawing card for New Brunswickers. It was timber country. It was well known because there were many New Brunswick and Nova Scotia families that moved there in the early development of that particular territory. And Charlotte County in my area in particular, with all its mills and other establishments, there were many, many people from Charlotte County who went out to Minnesota to try to start a new life in timber and milling, and stayed. And so there are many descendants of those areas, plus this area of Burt's Corner and around the ridge, and the Tripp family. Stephen did not stay. I discovered that he was out there in the period in 1861-62 because he didn't crop up in the census here. I couldn't imagine where he went, but he joined his brother for work. And when he came back in 1863, he decided it was time to settle down. And with the money that he had made, he had arranged with his, by that time, to be able to tell his father that he could afford to build a house. And in 1864, he started the house, which is the present farmhouse on Peter and Helene's property. The house at the time, it seems, I don't know whether the house was a drawing card or whether he had already made a promise to his new wife. He had approached Frances Mitchell. And by 1865, when the house was finished, he was ready to be married. And they moved into the new house. And so, and began to raise their family from 1865 onwards. I'm only speculating on that, but in terms of the timing, it seems as though he wanted to prepare the equivalent of almost a dowry that he could offer prospects to his new bride. So it seems as though he started on the house, and before he had the house finished, he proposed marriage. Now, from the 1860s to the end of that century, they raised their family there. By this time, the original ownership that the Tripp family had in the property next door that came down to the Gilby family had passed and was now sitting with the Inch family, the predecessors to the Gilbys. And so lot number 6 was the only property now left in the Tripp family name. There were other cousins of the Tripps who had actually moved to other areas down at the mouth of Keswick and even down as far as Canterbury. And I found some of them which had moved up to Woodstock, but I've not done a total genealogy. So Stephen and Frances set up shop. He farmed. We know, and this came out in the land registry records, as early as the 1820s, his grandfather and father were actually raising apples. They had their own orchards. And these are specifically mentioned in the deeds and documents. So we know that the apple history to the area is not a brand new entity, that it goes back a couple of centuries or more. And it also speaks of there being an earlier house closer to the road owned by Peelig Jr. There's about 1,000-foot driveway up to the current farmhouse built by Stephen Tripp. But between there and the current road, there was in fact another house that we're aware of that's mentioned in the documentation. So registry office records are really valuable that way. So Stephen Tripp and his wife raised 4 children. And if I can get them right here, Asa, who was also called Herman, James, let me just get my sheet correctly here. Too many people named each other. There was, yes, Herman. Unfortunately, they had a girl. It wasn't unfortunate to have the girl, but unfortunately for the little girl, she died in the first month of 1871. And they lost her, and they had one other daughter, Christiana. And they lived in the house from that period in the 1860s right up to the 20th century. And one of the most significant events during that period that surrounded the farmhouse was the fact that uh, although Herman didn't marry and he went off to New England where he stayed and died there in 1930, I found out that Christiana or Christine, or some people have called her, actually called her Kess, Kess, as a nickname. She married in 1895. She married a young jeweler who had a jewelry store in Fredericton named Robert Buchanan. He was a widower with a daughter, and after only a year of marriage, his wife died in St. John, and he moved up to open a store in Fredericton. And he met Christiana, who was going to normal school to become a teacher. And it turned out in 1895, there were arrangements for a marriage, and it was decided the marriage would take place at the farm. So Robert Buchanan, who actually was not wealthy, but reasonably well off, had worked it out with his new father-in-law that they would have the ceremony right at the farmhouse on the veranda. And so when that took place, he had, let me get this correctly. Yeah, the ceremony and the reception would take place at the farmhouse. And so on Wednesday, the 18th of September at 4 o'clock, about 125 guests showed up, entertained by a brass orchestra from the city to greet them from the veranda of the house. And on the wedding day, they also, and it was very common that after the ceremony or the day later, the new bride would receive well-wishers and they would show off their gifts. Well, in the newspaper article, it actually itemized one by one, every one of the gifts given to the couple and who gave it. So a bit of pressure on the people who gave gifts, I would think, to come up with something fairly unique. But and as a honeymoon, they stayed on the farm for a few days to visit relatives. And then they went back to St. John, where he was from originally, and topped off their honeymoon by attending the St. John exhibition, which was the event of the year, usually in September. So it was after that that Robert and Christina and Ethel, the stepdaughter now in this particular case to her, left the farm, and they actually moved down to Lawrence, Massachusetts. And by 1900, I found them listed in the Massachusetts census, where he actually took up a watch repair shop and a jewelry shop. Unfortunately, it was only shortly after they moved there that Robert actually died at the age of 38, because he didn't realize that working in watch repair involved leads and all kinds of other chemical compounds. And he got poisoned from long use in the room where they did this. And so Christiana was left as a widow very early on in the marriage, and she never remarried. Now, the interesting thing was at the wedding, Christiana had a bridesmaid who came from Bear Island, and her name was Cara Adelia Hallett. And Adelia, as they called her, was the daughter of James and Mary Hallett. And it turns out, and I'm not sure they knew each other previous to this event, but Delia Hallett seems to have, or the other way around, seems to have fallen for the brother of Christiana, James Tripp. And so it turned out they started dating. And by 1896, James William Tripp married Delia. And they moved into the house with the parents. Actually, it was only one parent because by this time his mother had passed away. So the father was living there with them. And so James and Delia took up housekeeping in the farm along with his father that they were looking after. Over the next decade, they ended up having 6 children. And that included Ruby May, Annie Pearl, Gladys, Frances Gertrude, James Stanley, and Mildred Adelia. And this is the last Tripp family to have inhabited the house as a Tripp house. Annie unfortunately died in infancy, and which was not an uncommon situation at that time. But this is when some major changes began to happen with the farm because along with the death of his father, Stephen, in 1900, they began to make changes in the actual farmhouse itself. And they added on to the back of the farm and added sheds and added farm animals to it, while still running an orchard and still raising this large family. Now, the next series of pictures I'm going to show you are from the house. Now, this rather stilted photo, I don't know whether I can make it a little bit larger. I don't know whether the person was under the influence when they took it, and there was a little off kilter, but it was a tiny photo taken in 1895 of the front of the house. We don't see the end of the house because the camera was almost on its side. By this time, inexpensive photography had started, and the little brownie cameras that many people may have heard of were now brought into regular use by consumers. And here we get a good distinctive picture of the front of the house and the upper window and the molding. And so it does give us a pretty good representation of it. And this was before any major add-ons in 1895. This was still when James' father, Stephen, was still alive. Now, James added buildings to the back, including barns, a hen house, and other facilities. But I just, through the great help of Mary Toole, Mary was Mildred's daughter, who was Mary Sinnott, Percy Sinnott and Mildred Sinnott. And I figured out from this picture, it was taken about 1912. And here's Delia Tripp and her 2 daughters. And one of them, I believe, is Gladys, and the other one was Mildred. I'm not 100% certain. And apparently they were raising geese on the farm at that time. Here's another shot. I'll take this down a bit, which shows Delia in the backyard feeding the geese. And you can see some of the orchard trees out back of the yard. Some of those are still present today. Then this is James William Tripp and Adelia in later years. The thing about it is I noticed, Delia is actually looking at a photo album. I'd love to have the photo album. But this I learned was taken about 1940. I think it was 1944 that James passed away. And this is taken out front of the house at the time. Delia continued to live in the house. And at that time, we'll go to a picture. This is actually James with a team of horses that he had on the farm. Certainly big brutes they are, good work horses. And again, taken around 1915. Now, I only put this in because this is their neighbor, Mr. Gilby. In 1901, the Inge family sold the house next door, the farm, and it went to Thomas Melbourne Gilby, and he was called Melbourne. His son Freeman took over the farm, and then it came down to Harry. But Thomas Melbourne was the one who did most of the changes in addition to their farm, but he was a great friend of James Tripp. They actually raised apples together. They raised honey together. They tapped trees. I have a report where they tapped 200 trees for syrup along the roadway between their lines. And they seemed to cooperate on a number of different levels when it came to the farming. There's a great story to be told even on that whole Gilby side of the family and activities. Now, one of the things where I find sources of great information is through Ancestry.com. Most people don't realize it, but those who moved to the United States, if you're trying to track them, starting in the 1920s and 30s, passport and naturalization papers began to require a photo to be attached. And by 1922, it seems to be regularly in fashion. Before that period is not. Well, here I discovered in this one, I'll blow it up a little bit. You can see it gives great detailed information, height, weight, occupation, down to location, where they were born, how they actually got to the United States to their location. And in this case, down to Hartford, Connecticut. And this is the application of Gladys Kathleen Tripp, James's daughter. She went down to be trained as a nurse, and it ended up she stayed and did in fact follow nursing for the rest of her life. But I'm told by Mary Toole that she often came home to visit the other family members and became a very favorite aunt. Now, I've cropped that so I could get a better picture. And once it's cleaned up, you can see she was a very handsome lady. She lived, I believe, until about 1979. I can't be exact on that, just going by memory. Not all records come up as good as this, but from time to time you'll find some interesting details, and lo and behold, you'll find a photograph. Now, in about 1940, this is what the house looked like. You can see the veranda is added, but you'll notice all the lines and poles out front, and it took a minute, but we finally figured out those are the clotheslines and clothes poles, and they hung their laundry out in the front area of the farmhouse. And if you look in closer, you can see the old rocking chair on the doorstep, the way they fashioned the veranda, and even up in the peak areas. And the side picture reveals a bit of the big old barn, which doesn't exist anymore. Here's the house front on about 1959, the wood pile at the side. I hope that's coming out okay. But again, you can see most of the woodwork and the side lights that are, if you're looking at doing any changes or architectural things, as Peter and Helene have done with the house. Then this takes it up to, I think this was about 19, I may not have this in order. I think this is back in the 40s, because there was a large extension on the back of the house, which was like a summer kitchen. And finally, when we bring it today, this is the work they've done based on the information we've been able to gather. And They've added the new siding and features and revived the old veranda, and it's nearly completed. There are a few other things to be done, but up in the peak, we found there was originally a window configuration like this, and particularly around the door with the side lights and the molding and trim. So they were able to adapt some of that to look at doing their renovations. So it has now been given a full Irish name. It's called Aisling Acray, Aisling, which means dream, and Acrai, which roughly translated is acres. So dream acres. I often think of green acres. But dream acres it is. And to finish off, the Tripp family lived in, or descendants of the Tripp family, and that included Percy Sinnott and Mildred, lived in the house right up until about 1960, and eventually sold out to Burris Coburn because he was raising apples, and through his company he formed in that period, he bought the property, and it was through his sons John and David that I've been able to learn more details more recently that I didn't have before, and how it was rented out to various families during that period in the 60s and the 70s, and occupied even by John and his family for a while. And so it has now come down to this modern period, and acquired by my son and daughter-in-law. And so to finish off, and I would entertain any questions, or if I can elaborate on things, as the sun sets over the farm, this is what it looks like at night. Thank you very much.
Oh, Roger, thank you so much. What a lovely presentation. I'm sure people are very excited to ask you some questions. So I am going to turn it over to Evelyn. So Evelyn, I'll get you to, I'm just going to find you here. I'm going to pin you so that everyone can see. And
all right.
There.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just unmuted myself. That's awesome, Roger. I love the presentation, especially the last picture. It was just stunningly beautiful, and just sort of a summary of the whole history of the house. I'm going to the chat right now, and we do have a few questions and a few comments, starting with Della Gleason and from Bangor. And she says that she is a Nason descendant. So maybe the two of you will have to get together and see if you're related in some way. And her husband, Mike, actually says we both are. So great. Yeah, it's good to see them coming home to watch our webinars. And
I provided my email to Heather, so feel free to share the email with your listeners.
I'll stick it right in the chat for everybody.
Thanks, Heather. And our first question that I can see comes from Russ, and his question was Peleg Tripp a loyalist settler?
Definitely a civilian, of course. As I mentioned, he and Jane Ogden first came up from Rhode Island, and their first allotments they received as refugees was in that Hampstead, Gagetown area. Some of the land was on the Washtenamock Lake, but from what I can determine, and there were other relatives who settled in the area as well, other Tripps, and some of the Smiths who married into the Tripps, but the land was unsuitable. And that's when he started wandering and seeking out other land. But he, in fact, received his first land as a loyalist refugee. And for those who aren't aware, you were called a loyalist refugee because you were loyal to King George III and did not side with the Americans in the American Revolution.
Well, that's good. Yeah, no, it's good that you've traced them all the way back to their loyalist connections. And yeah, I love the little bit at the beginning where you explained about the land grants and how they were acquired and how much everybody was eligible for, and the fact that some of them didn't even take up their land grants. So our next question is, was answered by you yourself in your presentation. And Kaylee, who asked if you had any present or historical photos of the Stephen Tripp farmhouse. And Heather answered it for in the chat, saying that yes, and more to come. So that's great. And Jillian has asked, why an Irish name for the house? Nason, ? Over Tripp's Irish in origin, ?
I should have elaborated there. My daughter-in-law is a good Irish girl from Clonmel near Tipperary, and whom my son met when he was doing a business after leaving university in Ireland, had the opportunity to work in that area, and lo and behold, they met, and she ended up being dragged back to New Brunswick.
I'm sure she wasn't dragged that unwillingly. It's a beautiful province.
It's an unusual Irish name, but it is totally Irish. The name is Caplice, the maiden name, Caplice, which is an old French name, I understand, but it goes back centuries in Ireland.
That's great. I'm glad that she's also able to trace back a little bit of her family tree. And Russ has commented, what an amazing lesson in exploring history. Thank you, Roger. And Jillian has asked, first she's comment, thank you. She said, that was just wonderful. I have some questions about the Tripp lineage, but maybe not everyone listening here will be interested. Could I contact you directly? And she goes on to explain that William, who came to Ontario, is my 4th great grandfather. So that's an amazing connection. And as Heather said, she's going to put your email at the end of the chat, or in the chat, and I see it now. So yeah, so do you have any problem with Jillian contacting you, Roger, to discuss more
not
of the
at
history?
all. In my original work, because I didn't have a genealogy to start with and had to build it, I started making spreadsheets of the family names, because as many of you can probably attest to, people like to repeat names through the generations. So you get a lot of Williams and a lot of Michaels, and even Peleg. But it turns out I was able to, one of Gladys, one of the James's daughters, whose name was Ruby May, I believe married a Randall from Lawrence, Massachusetts. And believe it or not, I found a connection through Ancestry that actually did some of the Tripp family going back several generations. Not all the detail is there, but I was able to flesh out a skeleton. And for instance, I do know that Peleg Sr. was born in 1734 in Newport, Rhode Island, and he married Jane Ogden in 1736, and he ended up having 9 children, of which Peleg Jr., the one that took over the farm, his actual first name was Nathaniel, but he never went by Nathaniel, which is very confusing if you're trying to find land documents. The William that is spoken about in the next generation is Peleg Jr.'s son, who went off to Ontario, and he had a very large family, 8 or 10. And I've been able to discover, I think there was a connection with the Clark family. And many of the Clarks, David Clark being one of them, married into the Tripps, and they moved off to Ontario with William. And those are the ones that settled in that area near Oxford County, near Ingersoll, Ontario, and stayed in that area. And I do have some information that is sort of beginning to take shape, but I don't have a full picture yet. and I certainly would enjoy communicating with somebody from Ontario.
All right, so I think you found her. And I'll skip to the end of the chat and go back to the next question. But Jillian said, yes, David Clark married Mary Ann Tripp and all live near Ingersoll, Clark's Corner. Thank you.
Ah, there we go. So,
And Russ asked, do we know how the Tripp Road happened to be routed the way it was?
that's a strange one because unfortunately, and I think the answer is to be found in the provincial archives. And since I couldn't access the road commissioner's records, if I had some detail from that, when they begin to build roads after the War of 1812, and the first part of the road was turned from a bridle path to the road we know today, and it comes up and makes the sharp turn. It was following the back lines of many of the grants of that first division. And then there was a second division, which takes it up over the hill, over the ridge, and all the way down the other side to the Mactaquac stream. Ezra Day is one that comes to mind. And interesting enough, and there's a little side story here, when the road was built, they cut off the corner of number 5 and 6, and a little triangle across the road by the brook there ended up becoming called Tripp's Jog, because it always appears in the deeds, but it was about some say as many as 30 acres, but I think it was much smaller. And it's been said that Peelig Sr., when he died in the 1820s, is buried in that jog area, which is comes up to the corner of Holyoke Road. I think it's owned by Mr. Gallagher today, but somewhere in there, there are 3 or 4 plots that are unmarked. It was just piles of rocks that back in the 1960s that were still apparent. I should mention that the brook that runs down through there is called Dan's Brook, which I'm told is named after Daniel McGran, who owned the land on the other side.
All right, that's great. And our next question, I believe it came from Kaylee. She asked, during renovations and life on the property, were any neat historical objects found? And Helene answered that actually in the chat. And she said, we found an old horse bit, old workhorse shoes, an old paper that was used to line under the board siding. Also an old Victorian carpet was used along the wall lining. So, oh, those are awesome things to have found in the house. So yeah. And Troy also has a comment and a question. He's asked, is the attic room still there?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Sounds like Troy's been in the house before.
Yeah.
And Helene also has a comment. She said, Peter and I really love the old farmhouse that was so strongly built, but we're also very grateful to those who looked after the house so well before us, particularly the Coburns, probably Troy's family, and Tia Burgers, who we purchased the house from. So yeah, that ends our comments in the chat room, but we can also open it up for anybody who has any comments that they want to ask. And because everybody is muted, if you could put raise your hand, which is the Zoom function at the bottom of the screen, so that we can unmute you and you can ask your question.
I would hope that as I refine the story, that eventually, as I said to Heather, I might offer it to the society so that whether through a newsletter or some other means, they may want to tell the story to other people on the ridge and beyond. And maybe we would encourage others to do the same, because put together, there are a number of great stories from the Jones family, the McKeans, the Yorkses, and others up and down that road that are yet to be told. And the story of Daniel McGran is a great one because he's the father of Fred McGran, who became the senator. And he was Dr. McGran out in Fredericton Junction. And the funny thing was, he was my mother's doctor when we lived in Fredericton Junction.
The Gilbys had great
lots
stories
of
too.
Oh yes, there are tons of Gilby possibilities there.
Yeah. Old Mr. Gilby used to tell me a lot of stories when he was alive. And when Peter and I first brought the property, it wasn't long after that he came down to visit, and he would kind of be the foreman on any changes or buildings that we were making. And he'd give us his stamp of approval if he liked it or not, or he'd give us suggestions. And he was really happy when he saw us doing it up. And he was really happy to see that we brought horses back to the property. And he told me that where we built the barn is not too far from where the barn originally had stood. So it was nice to hear all his stories. He also had really amazing stories from the whole neighborhood, and I just wish I could have recorded them. We used to say that he was like the mayor of Keswick because he knew so much and so many people around the area, and he would laugh and say, I am the mayor of Keswick. So I miss him a lot.
Indeed he was. Yes.
Mhm.
Well, thanks,
Maybe
Aline.
maybe we could authorize Russ to write all this up. He probably has nothing to do, just
See if he
twiddling his
volunteers.
thumbs.
We'll see if it takes you up on your offer.
You just try me.
Sounds like a challenge. All right. So I guess it seems like people can unmute themselves if they wanted to ask a comment or ask a question. So I think that at this point, and we'll like to end it. And great. And I'd like to thank Roger for his wonderful presentation and taking the time to share his passion and research with us. It definitely was a wonderful presentation. I've learned lots, and I'm glad that all this information is being recorded and shared with us. I'm just going to put a plug in for our next installment, which is next week, same time, same place. Again, go to our Facebook group for the Zoom link. And next Sunday, we're going to be having Dr. Jane Jenkins with us, and she's going to present on a topic entitled "It Was a Pitiful Time: Lost Voices of Canada's 1918 Influenza Epidemic." And she's going to use firsthand accounts of New Brunswickers who experienced the 1918 epidemic to paint a picture of life during that time. So I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating presentation and well worth coming back to see us virtually, of course. And as Heather mentioned at the beginning, yes, we're always looking for new members. And so far, because of the circumstances, we've been having monthly Zoom meetings. So that means that you can participate from anywhere in the world. If you're interested in joining us or becoming members, send us an email to our email, which is Keswick Ridge Historical Society @gmail.com. Or you can message us on our Facebook group for more information. And we also receive lots of requests from people whose ancestors lived here, going back to the Loyalist era or earlier. And we have lots of genealogical questions and documents. So our capital campaign, which is quite important to us right now, and which you can donate to, is going to allow us to complete an addition to our general store to create a space for our artifacts, but also to allow us a space to access our genealogical documents and to read about the families in the area. And so if you want to learn how to donate to our capital campaign, you can do it two ways. You can go to our website at keswickridge.ca, or you can go directly to canadahelps.org to make a donation that way. And now I've finished our little plug for our Historical Society. Again, I want to say thank you to Roger and for everybody else who participated today. Lots of great questions, lots of great comments, and lots of great information being shared. I admit the Tripp Settlement Road to me, I didn't know anything about its early history. Now I know how important it was and how far back it goes and how important it was to the families in that area. So yeah, definitely thank you very, very much, Roger.
And thank you for everyone's help in pulling this off.
Oh, well, it's well worth it because it was an excellent presentation and it's being recorded. So I suspect it'll be out there in our social media and on our website in the near future. So if you know anybody who missed it today, just keep an eye out, and they can also go and view our recording a little later on.
And
So
if I can give you a little, if I can offer you a little teaser, I soon will be writing up the story of the Bertha Weary mystery ghost.
Oh, I think
some of you probably have heard of her, but not many have heard the long story of her demise and the murder mystery connected with the ridge.
Ooh.
Never heard this. This is great. And I'm sure the Wary family also will be interested in this. So yeah, hopefully sooner than later. Please have this ready. Let us know. We'll find a way to share it.
All righty. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you, Roger. Bye-bye, everybody. See you next week.
Bye.